Hello, everyone. This is Marc Sabatella from Outside Shore Music. And this is going to be one of these things like getting 2024 written in correctly on my checks. I got to remember to say Outside Shore Music, but that's me, yes. And here we are for the Music Masterclass, my regular Thursday series, where we talk about creating music, all aspects of music making, from composing, arranging, improvisation, ear training, all the creative acts of making music. And so, what we're going to do today is we're going to do some kind of ear training things, and we're going to take a look at some. We're going to look at some music that's been submitted so far. But I want to talk in particular a little bit more about Rhapsody in Blue, which if you all, hopefully you all get my newsletter and saw the article that I put in the In Theory section, where I just got inside one little passage of Rhapsody in Blue and talked about what was going on with it. I'm going to talk about a different passage today, and we're going to do some ear training with it because I'm going to make you get the thing by ear. All right. So what I got to do here is pull it up on my other computer so you can't see it, because I don't want you all to see what I'm playing, right? So give me 1 second, because I forgot forgot to do that, right? Forgot that I needed to get that up on a different screen. But I'll tell you what the line is going to be. So let me give you a little background while I do this, all right? So Rhapsody in Blue, for those who don't know, I mean, it's a piece by George Gershwin that premiered 100 years ago and is, depending on who you ask, either extremely important to certain aspects of the history of music or completely overrated. And I don't want to get into that, but I will say it is a very interesting piece of music that has had a lot of influence. And it premiered 100 years ago next week. So that's why we're kind of like focusing on it a little bit right now. And so George Gershwin is someone who also, like, if you're a classical musician, you might know of Gershwin and say, oh yeah, he's that guy who kind of does some jazzy stuff. And if you're a jazz person, you might think of Gershwin and say, oh yeah, he's that guy who kind of does some classical stuff, right? He lives in both worlds. But really not entirely in either, because really one of his main claims to fame is neither jazz nor, in fact, his actual jazz pedigree is virtually non-existent. He didn't, like, he wasn't a jazz player himself. At least I've never heard any recording of him playing jazz. But his songs are very often covered by jazz musicians because he wrote a lot of musical theater, and those were the songs that jazz musicians were jumping on because he seemed to have like a language of how he wrote for musical theater that worked well for jazz. And by the way, as far as checks, I do see the comments in here. Checks are very seldom used by most of us. I write one check a month, and it is for my studio rent right here. And that's basically it. Pretty much everything else I do electronic. But spelling wise, it's definitely the CK spelling. All right, so that piece has this whole pedigree of Gershwin being this person who comes from a classical background, but also has a foot in the jazz world, not so much from playing jazz, but from just having an understanding of it. That was, pretty good for someone who wasn't like a full-time jazz musician himself. And so one of the things that I talked about in the video the other day was just how he used particular voicings and particular rhythms in ways that, I think captured a lot of what he wanted to capture about a jazz sound, but put it in a context where I thought it made sense for the piece it was trying to be. Rhapsody in Blue is trying to bridge this gap. The section we're going to look at today is interesting because the section we looked at yesterday didn't involve blues elements at all, really. It had different aspects of the harmonic language of jazz that weren't specifically blues. The section we're going to look at today is going to talk about is going to be looking at this blues element, and what's funny about it is it actually harkens back to modal type thinking. In other words, we're going to hear sounds that are reminiscent of Renaissance use of Mixolydian mode and similar kinds of sounds. And you might think, well, gee, was that really a thing that early blues musicians were dealing with? And I will say, well, maybe they weren't listening to that directly, but they were being informed by the same fundamental truths that caused the same fundamental truths in terms of how instruments are tuned, how the harmonic series works, and all this stuff. The same things that cause Renaissance musicians or ancient Greek musicians to hit on these certain combinations of modes, certain combinations of pitches as being interesting to work with. Blues musicians hit on those same sounds, probably for the same underlying reasons, as well as other more sort of cultural reasons and practical considerations and things. So anyhow, what I'm putting that out there, that the Mixolydian mode is going to be part of what we're going to be thinking about, because as we do this ear training that I want us to do, I'm going to want you maybe accessing that. So if I talked about Mixolydian mode, I'm gonna be asking questions of you, and I want you to type your answers into the chat, but I won't always wait for answers because then it's a lot of waiting around, but I want to encourage that conversation. So I want to hear for anyone who has a concept of what the Mixolydian mode is to you. How would you describe it in one sentence? Depending on your background, I expect wildly different answers. Just like the thing about the elephant, right? People, if depending on whether you're looking at them from the front or the back or the rear or just feeling it, you get all sorts of different impressions of what an elephant is, and they're all correct, right? If you just feel the trunk, you think that, and if you just feel the tail, you think that. If you just know the ears, you think that, right? So, I think it's usually talked about like a blind person just trying to explore the animal. But in any case, there's lots of different ways we can talk about the Mixolydian mode that are all accurate. I want to hear like a one sentence short characterization. What does it mean to you? And if you're like, I've never heard of it, let me know. And if it's, yeah, I've heard of it, but I really have no idea what it is, let me know. I want to hear everyone's answers to that. Meanwhile, while that happens, I am now going to finish pulling up the sheet music that I wanted to pull up here and hear your answers. And while that happens, I'm just going to tell you about my own relationship to Rhapsody in Blue, because it's kind of a funny, I don't know if it's a funny story, but it's an interesting to me story anyhow, so y'all get to hear it. I did a concert on pretty short notice. Someone offered me the opportunity to do a weekend concert at a venue, and I didn't really have music prepared. I didn't have the right ensemble prepared. I said, I'm going to do something with string quartet. I'm going to write a lot of music for string quartet and piano, and write this music and get a string quartet together and rehearse it and present it at this concert. And it was really only like a month or so away, and it was a crazy thing to do, but it went really well. And someone who was in the audience worked for the Denver Public Library and said, we have a concert series too, and we would love to have you take this group and perform at the Denver Public Library, especially if you could do Rhapsody in Blue, because the director of the program really loves that piece and has always dreamed of having it performed as part of that series. So I took it on myself to take Rhapsody in Blue, which was originally written for piano with kind of an orchestra accompaniment, but it was the Paul Whiteman Orchestra, which is this sort of weird jazz classical combination orchestra. And so it was written by Gershwin for that group to be the accompaniment. But then it was also prepared. He eventually did a duo piano arrangement and then solo piano arrangement also. So I looked at all those sources, and then it was totally reorchestrated later for a larger orchestra. So I looked at as many of the sources as I could and figured out how I could reduce that accompaniment down to just a string quartet, and then learned the piano part, which I had never learned before, and it's got some hard stuff in it. Some of it's not so bad, but a lot of it's kind of hard. Anyhow, I got that arrangement written, learned the piece, and we performed that thing at that library concert, and it was a blast. And I learned a lot, and it was a great experience. I'll see if I can get the link and put that for you at some point. All right, so Mixolydian. Now that I've got a bunch of answers here, it's interesting to me that everyone. Well, not everyone, but many people are giving the same kind of characterization, which I would say is a very modern characterization. So if we say it's the major scale with the seventh flatted, or as Nicholas is saying, without the leading tone, it's not. So if I say, like, I'm going to play it in B flat because that's what key it's going to be in. A is our leading tone. Mixolydian doesn't mean we skip the leading tone. It means we flat it and do that. So the idea that I can take a major scale and flat the 7th degree and get a Mixolydian scale out of it is a very modern way of looking at it. Allison, if you're here, you're going to be going, no, 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 it's not that, right? Because that's not really quite so accurate. The way Stephen, I mean, it's totally accurate for the modern perception of what this is about. If we want to look at more historically, it's not like you would make a Mixolydian, it's not like major scale was our starting point. Major scale was not any more important of a scale than Mixolydian or Dorian or Aeolian, right? These modes all had their own unique identity, but the way Stephen is putting it, it's white notes on the piano starting on G. I should make sure that I'm correctly sharing my keyboard, but I think I am. Yes, I am. So that idea that I'm all white notes starting on G, this is maybe a little more to the point. It was a way of taking the notes that already existed and saying, yeah, if you end on a particular note, that makes it Mixolydian. There's more to it than that, because it's whether you end there, but also whether the range of the melody goes above or below or both. And so there's hypo, all these different things in the Renaissance classification systems, because that changed over the years. So I had lots of different ways of looking at it. But I will say, for practical purposes, if we imagine the major scale is king, and if we just flatten the 7th, we get a Mixolydian scale, that's a great way of looking at it. And if you look at G, that would be G major. And if we do this, use only white notes, we have indeed flatted the 7th. So if we imagine that the major scale is more important than the rest, and Mixolydian is a modified major scale, it's maybe not historically accurate way of looking at it, but it's a precisely accurate way of describing it. So there you go. All right, so there's our scale. B flat major. And if I flatten the A, you know what I'm going to do? Actually, I'm going to stop screen sharing, because I now realize you're going to see my keys too. So I'm just going to stop screen sharing for a moment here and simplify my life. Stop sharing. Hi, everyone. Okay, so now that you can't see my screen, I have a much easier time of dealing with this. You don't have to look at don't have to look at the keys on the keyboard, and yeah, that simplifies things. So that is Mixolydian major. All right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to play the first four, not the first. Okay, so the first measure is right, the clarinet trill, and then the big glissando up to the B flat. Right, that's the first measure. All right. Skipping that, this is the main introductory theme. I'm going to play it. Most of you have heard it before, and I want you to do your best to figure out the notes. If you got a pencil and paper, try to scribble them down. If it's convenient to type them into MuseScore, go for that. Or if you just want to sing them and try to name the notes. Big fan of my paper keyboard, right? If you can play that thing on the paper keyboard and sing along with it and convince yourself that you've got the right notes, I want you thinking about what these notes actually are going to be. And Allison's got kind of the more, Renaissance way of looking at it, starting on the dominant. And that's actually kind of an interesting way of looking at it as well, saying that if we imagine C major, well, now we're starting on G, the dominant. So that's another way of looking at things. All right, I'm going to play this melody a few times, and I just want you to try to basically write it out. I'm going to slightly simplify. I'm going to omit any like ornaments and things and just give you the basics of the melody. So I want you to listen to it, try to figure out the pitches. If you're not somewhere where you can write or doing anything, that's fine. Imagine. Try to think of what's going on. And I'll play it, talk about it, play it, talk about it. Then we'll look at what's going on and look at it in a little more detail. So I'm going to play it at this tempo. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's the melody. Most of you have heard that melody before. I'm going to play it again right away and start thinking about what the actual pitches are. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to give us a little while just on the ear aspect of this. So you do what it takes. Find a scrap of paper. Do what it takes to try to figure this out. Or if it just means typing into the chat what you think the pitches are. Maybe put in your first cut at the pitches, but don't send it until you've listened to it a couple more times and fix some more things. But let's also talk about the rhythms. And, let's try to get as much as we can about this melody by ear. Here it is again. 1, 2, 3, 4. Give you a moment. I'm going to do this 2 more times. 2 more times. Yeah. Each time, hopefully you can get a little more detail about it. When you think you have something, maybe still don't post it yet. If you've already started to actually hit enter, that's fine. But get your responses ready. Anything you want to say about what you think the pitches are, what you think the rhythms are. But I'm going to play it 2 more times, and then we'll see what people think. Here we go. Second to last time. 1, 2, 3, 4. So one thing you may have noticed is even though I talked about the Mixolydian mode, it's not just those notes. Hopefully you've figured that out by now. There are notes in this piece that are not in the Mixolydian mode. And that's part of what we want to, understand about it. So there's an aspect of it that's major, there's an aspect about it that's Mixolydian, but there's aspects of it that are something else still. And we're going to, get to look at all of that once I actually show you the music. So here is last time hearing that melody. 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, if anyone was watching my finger that time, I got off on my count, but hopefully you didn't throw anyone. All right, so what I would like now is, I don't know, start telling me stuff about it. If you think you have all the pitches, put those in. If you think you've got like a snippet where you've written it out on paper or in MuseScore and you want to take a picture and post that into the chat, go for that. Or if you just want to describe what you heard in terms of the pitches, do whatever makes sense to you to share what you think you figured out about that melody. Meanwhile, I'm going to come back and reset up my screen share so we can get get some real answers here. So give me a second. Meanwhile, wait and see what people come up with here. All right, I'm not going to share quite yet. I'm going to give it a couple seconds. But I'm all ready to share. I just need to hit the final button here. What I'm going to do, well, actually, let me go ahead and share, but not show you the music yet. So now you'll see my fingers. Right? Love to see some sort of, okay, so Walter's got some good notes in here. So one thing that Walter is showing here are the A flats and the G flat. He's totally right that there is A flat and there's G flat in there. That G flat is not part of the Mixolydian mode, right? So we're going to talk about how that got in there. We're going to totally talk about how that got in there. I'm going to now play it can I play it from memory? You would think so. When I'm put on the spot, can I do it from memory? I'm scared. I will be honest with you. But I'm going to try to play it from memory so I can do it one more time without showing you the answer yet, and see if we can get a couple more comments in the chat. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. So are lots of people having video pausing problems, or is that more of an internet thing at other people's end? Just curious. But in any case, there you go. So the fact that you haven't heard it before, great. It's a little bit of an ear challenge, and it's got this interesting mix of that modal sound with other sounds that we can talk about, other borrowed scales and so forth. So it's a good challenge. But yeah, if the video pauses, that's going to make it complicated. All right. I'm going to now share the music, and then we're going to talk about it. So this is what the music looks like. I am correctly sharing my screen now, right? Let me make sure that I'm seeing on screen what I need to see. I don't even... Right here. Yeah, okay. So this is the music, and so the pitches are this. First it's B flat. Now we have back and forth A flat and G flat. Triplets. Ba-do-da-do-da-dum. The next line is ba-do-da-da-do-da-dum. So F, E flat, D, D flat, E flat, E, F. So coming down, it's still within the majors. So this A flat, right, it was Mixolydian. G flat's not. We'll come back to that. Then F, E flat, D. That's all part of major or Mixolydian. D flat is like, okay, where did that one come from? So we'll talk about the D flat and the G flat in a second. Now on the way up, the E is also not in major or Mixolydian. Here, I can give you two different answers about what it's doing there, but it's a passing tone, right? 4 sharp 4 5. I mean, that's like, right? Whoops. That I got the wrong melody, right? So passing tone, that sharp 4 passing tone approach to 5 is like all over tons of music. All right, the next measure is which is Mixolydian, and then our G flat comes back. So let me ask you another question here and get some answers into chat. A flat is the note that is not in B flat major that is in Mixolydian, right? So the A flat is the one note that I can totally kind of explain by saying it's Mixolydian. What are the other non-diatonic notes, and what would explain them? I already talked about the E natural as being just a chromatic passing tone, right? It gets me from 4 to 5. 4 sharp 4 5. So let's accept E natural as just chromatic passing tone. Let's talk about the G flat and the D flat that are also not in the key of B flat, major or Mixolydian, and tell me, well, where do they come from? How did they get in there? What makes them make sense? Meanwhile, I'm going to play. Like, I haven't looked at this arrangement, so this was adapted by someone. I think I know who that person is, but I'm not going to swear that this is really particularly faithful to anything. I didn't play this passage. This was part of the orchestra passage, so this is what I arranged for string quartet. But that chord there, totally unexpected, right? Then So, trying to play his arrangement there, and I left out the little grace note things. I don't know if that gives anyone any more insight into anything or not, but I want to hear some answers. What is that G flat doing there? What is that D flat doing there? What can we say about it that would help us figure out these pitches by ear and figure out why Gershwin wrote this and what any of it has to do with jazz? So I'm going to try to play that again because it's fun. So, I will continue to give people opportunities to give your answers. Meanwhile, I'm going to give you some of my answers here. G flat and D flat are not in the key of B flat major. They are in the key of B flat minor. So that idea of mixture between major and minor and combining them both next to each other, like this D natural, that juxtaposition of the D natural and the D flat, major and minor sounds, major and minor scale sounds in the same measure intermixed like that is a very common jazz thing. And, there'll be all sorts of other ways where we might hear them together. That is a very blues thing, right? So the fact that we are very specifically borrowing those two notes, G flat, scale degree flat 6, and D flat, scale degree flat 3, is basically we're borrowing from the minor key. And for that matter, A flat also. I called it Mixolydian, but A flat also comes from the minor key. We could say it comes from Mixolydian. We can say it comes. So I'll get back to Stephen's comment in a second. But yeah, that A flat, we could say, that A flat comes from Mixolydian, which is true, or we could say it comes from minor, which is also true. We could also say that Mixolydian itself is like taking a major scale, and instead of just saying we're flatting the seventh, we could say we're borrowing one minor key note. That's what we could do. We could say this scale, that Mixolydian mode has other, think of mode as being like key and scale is scale. So a key isn't just a scale, right? It's a set of notes plus a whole set of conventions for how those notes get used. I would say the same about mode. A mode is a set of notes plus a set of conventions for how those notes are used, but I can still just talk about the scale itself. So I'll call that the Mixolydian scale if I need to make that distinction. So that set of notes is like the major set of notes, but borrowing a little bit from minor. All right, so Stephen is commenting about the spelling of that second chord is not really supposed to be a C sharp or an A. Oh, I played it wrong because I played an E natural. Silly, and that's why I was thinking this doesn't sound right at all. That's the right sound. I knew something was off. So, bad me. Like I said, I didn't play it that way. I knew it didn't sound right, but that's the deal. This E flat is an E flat, not an E natural like I played it before. So this is what's going on. So we could try to analyze that harmonically and knowing that the holograph. So when he talks about a holograph, that really means, actually I don't know why they call it that. I'm not sure, because, we think of a holograph or a hologram as, this particular sort of three-dimensional sort of thing, but really it just means a photograph of the original manuscript. This chord here would be an E flat half diminished chord if I were to think of it that way, and it would be spelt exactly that way: E flat, G flat, B double flat, D flat. So if we were to think of this as a 4 half diminished chord, that would explain that spelling. I'm not going to stress about that particular chord because it's actually quite complicated to really get into, but we're going to look at some of the rest of it. Now the next chord, and it does have it has that B flat in the bass. So I'll just think of that as the chord. Ah. So it's a B flat dominant 7th chord, right? It's got an A flat in it. And it's got that 9th, like I talked about in the video earlier this week. So this should be kind of a 1 chord. And yet it's played as a dominant 7th chord. Well, in part, it's because it is going to 4, right? In the middle of the measure, we have an E flat triad there. And he's even got a nice little passing tone to get us down to that E flat, right? So we could say that, yes, this is a 5 of 4. We could say it's, B flat 7, 5 of 4, resolving to 4. And it just happens to have that nice 9th chromatic motion going down there. Nothing all that unusual about that. However, the fact this particular dominant 7th 1 chord does happen to go to 4, but one of the things that you'll learn about if you study jazz or blues is that in jazz and blues, this idea of borrowing freely between the major and the minor and using of that chord in particular, this 1 chord but with a dominant 7th, this is a big part of the language of that. In a sense, this is the 1 chord in blues. The 1 chord in a blues just has that A flat in it. We always think about Mixolydian mode, basically, when we're thinking about the 1 chord. I mean, we don't literally think Mixolydian mode, but the sound that we associate in blues with the 1 chord is this sound. It's a Mixolydian sound. This is our tonic, 1, 3, 5, flat 7, and it doesn't necessarily want to resolve. And it might use that flat 3rd also. So this is blues language here. It's taking the major scale, but it's using that flatted 7th as not necessarily something that's a secondary dominant that has to resolve somewhere, but is just part of the melody. And so that's why I started this whole discussion by talking about Mixolydian. The idea that that A flat is just like belongs in this key. We barely even think about it being borrowed. Now that D flat, when it comes in, notice that D flat borrowed from minor happens right on top of that 4 chord. The 4 chord also, if we borrow the D flat, we get a dominant 7th 4 chord. Well, that's also a big part of the blues language. It's borrowing scale degree flat 3, and in particular borrowing it when we come to the 4 chord. We can also borrow it on the 1 chord, and we get this dissonant sound, right? This is dissonant. Flat 3 against major 3. But you will see this all over the place in blues and jazz. It's just part of the sound of that genre. But using it here over the 4 chord is also super common. And then check it out. Now we get a G flat against the E. This sound here is an augmented 6th chord. And then we get another one. Whoops. Another augmented 6th chord down here. Resolving to 5. And here, that augmented 6th chord resolves to 5. This augmented 6th chord resolved back directly to 1. But it's also more of just passing tone motion. G, G flat, F. Right? It's a nice little melodic motion. You could even think of as kind of a minor 4 chord sound, even though the melody is now on the E natural. So the chord that's happening here is more about the voice leading, more about that G, G flat F, and E flat E F, and letting both those things happen together and accepting the dissonance that happens along the way. So, Gershwin is a pretty clever guy. I mean, he is aware of all of this stuff, was aware of all these things I'm talking about, the degree to which this stuff is borrowed from odes, the degree to which this is blues language, the degree to which the voice leading is important also. All this stuff is all part of Gershwin's language. And so It's good to know. And then the line ends. So here we have our 5 chord right there, 5 chord with flat 9 in the melody. You know, not so much a Renaissance device, more of a Baroque device, but definitely been around since Bach. The idea of this, because really it's basically our 7 chord as a fully diminished chord, but with scale degree 5 in the bass. And so, yeah, you'll see starting in the Baroque era, that became a very commonly used sound. So, anyhow, I am using this, well, first of all, because it's a fascinating piece at a lot of levels, and, you know, we'll probably talk more about it over the coming week also. But I want to make that association in your brain between understanding and the ear. I'm always trying to increase that. And so by first saying, hey, let's just listen to this thing and try to figure out the melody notes, now let's try to understand what's going on and see to what extent now when I play that melody again, if it makes a little bit more sense to your ear. So I'm just going to play it just as a melody. So when you hear it just as a melody there, can your ear fill in any of that harmonic information now that we've talked through it a little bit? Play it again. And as you can see, as I mentioned before, I'm skipping the ornaments because they're not important to understanding. They make it sound better. You know, however that goes. You know, it sounds cool to use the ornaments, but they don't add to our harmonic understanding of the piece. They just make things sound cooler. And that's why they typically get written in with small notes like that to, you know, say, hey, this isn't harmonically significant. It just sounds cool. All right, so I'm going to play it now with just a real simple harmonization to kind of try to bring all this stuff together and maybe make 1 or 2 more points, and then we'll just go on and take a look at some more music. There's our 1 chord, and now the funny chord, which, yeah, it's some sort of weird 4 chord. And now our 1 chord with a dominant 7th, our 4 chord, back to 1, our augmented 6th chord, and then our 5 chord. I keep hesitating when I get there because I don't remember that chord, that 5 chord, waiting until the G flat. I remember it going like this in that measure. So I remember that chord coming in on 3. And I'm probably totally wrong in my memory. Stephen, you've got the holograph in front of you. Maybe you could tell me. Am I just, maybe elsewhere in the piece is the deal. Because that would have allowed me to make the point about hearing that A flat against A, which is the same sound that I talked about here, right? Hearing a major and minor third on the same chord. Here, it's a major and minor third on the same chord also, on our 5 chord, which is also part of this jazz blues sound. So yeah, I'm a little curious about that, but I'm sure maybe somewhere else in the piece he exploits that, even if he doesn't here. The one, okay, that's good to know that really is accurate. Okay, that's, you know, makes me trust this arrangement a little more. The other thing that I'm going to point out before I go away is take a look at the next measure. Whoops. Now, if you ever had any reason to wonder, well, why is it that parallel fifths are such a big deal? Why do they tell you not to do that or think? Listen to that sound. I can't even play it. That is the sound of parallel fifths. It is a raw, almost crude sound. Yeah? These are parallel fifths. If you ever wanted to know what do parallel fifths sound like and why are they a thing that gets avoided in a lot of styles, it's because they sound like that. even if you dress them up by playing full triads, it still has this very raw sound. But notice I'm using terms like raw, almost crude, but I'm not saying good, bad. That's a different question entirely. Yes, that's going to sound terrible if you're writing a motet, a Renaissance style motet, or whatever, a Baroque fugue, an early classical sonata or something. It's going to not sound good at all to do that. But if you're trying to capture this blues sound, or a rock sound for that matter, not that rock had even come along yet, that type of parallel fifths is part of that sound. So when I talk about rules in music being like law of gravity, they don't tell you what to do or what not to do, they just tell you what's going to happen. I'm telling you, if you write parallel fifths, you get that sound. No ifs, ands, ors about it. Parallel fifths give you that sound. Then you get to decide if that's the sound you want. So that was a whole exploration of that piece with that ear training aspect, and hopefully people found it somewhat useful or interesting. I do want to encourage people to follow up on those of you who are gold members. I posted a project in the Harmony workshop, which is going to be combined with the other workshops soon as I can take advantage of this new circle feature they keep promising. But I had shared, well, I guess that's where that thing was. It was in here. It wasn't in the newsletter. So if some of you didn't see the business about that I was talking about earlier, about me talking about 4 other measures of this, that's true. I think it was in the workshop here. So some of you might not have seen that. But I'm going to encourage you to do what I asked in there, which is post in response your own little analyses there. And so I'm going to briefly take a look at what Graham posted here, and then we're going to look at a piece that he posted several weeks ago, and I keep not getting to, and I'm going to stop myself from talking about his piece after a couple minutes so that we can look at his arrangement. So he is talking about the Verdi Requiem. So this section here is in C minor, but it finishes in C major. Well, that's perfectly normal in Renaissance and Baroque music to have sections to finish on a 1 chord, the Picardy third, right? That's so common to end a minor key piece in the major key. It's just all over the Renaissance and Baroque. It starts to fall out of fashion at some point after that. By some point, Beethoven's like, yeah, if I'm going to write a minor key piece, it's going to end minor, damn it, right? But up until that point, up until some point anyhow, it was very traditional to end minor key pieces on a major chord. So these sounds are not Renaissance sounds. So if your head is totally in Renaissance music, the sound of 19th and 20th and 21st century music is it's new, and it's a new thing to explore for sure. And we all have our different tastes, and that's fine. So what Graham is observing here, let me get out of the showing the score, but let's look at his comment. So he says the section is in minor, it ends in major, but instead of just raising the third, he goes in via a B diminished, and he does this twice, right? He does it in 407 and 415, and is sort of musing to himself why. And so this is kind of interesting. So if I play through this passage, whoa. So he's calling this B diminished, right? This sound right here. And he's absolutely right that this is a B diminished chord, right? That is a B diminished chord. However, look at what's going on in that inner voice. This is basically just a reduction of what's going on here. I don't know that it is everywhere, but at least in this passage, what we are looking at in this keyboard part is essentially just a reduction of what's in the vocal parts. So if we follow that line with the A flat, that's this line right here, the second to top line. And so it's... The question is this a B diminished chord? In which case the G is like a non-chord tone, a neighbor tone, and then we come back to the diminished? Or is it really a G7 chord, right? Is it the 5 chord? And the A flat is our non-chord tone, our flat 9. when I said before that that was a thing that goes back, this playing around with this relationship between 5 or 7, that I shouldn't be doing it in root position, and we'll talk about that in a second, but 7 to 1 or 5 to 1. If we want to kind of combine those two sounds together, you get that sound that I mentioned with the Gershwin. But here it is in Verdi. This is like 300 years earlier. Please tell me when this piece was written, because I have no idea. But Gershwin was 1924. How far am I off if I say 300 years earlier? Verdi Requiem. Someone tell me what year. So whether or not we call this B diminished, that just happens to visit the G, or if we call it G7 and it just happens to visit the A flat, we're clearly hearing those sounds juxtaposed. We are hearing exactly the sound that I was just talking about in the Gershwin. It's that same sound, dominant seventh with a flat 9, which is kind of a diminished with this. So nothing like 300? Well, no, I'm okay. I haven't gotten an actual year yet. Verdi Requiem date. Nowhere near. Yeah, for some reason I was thinking Verdi was older than he is. So silly me. I have my head in the Renaissance. So there you go. So this piece is, I was really thinking that he was 100 years before he was. Bad me. So let's go back here, and we have that sound. So we have that 5 to 1 sound. So the question is, so opera guy, so, the thing is, if I had that in my head, I totally would have been thinking that. But I'm not thinking that, because I'm looking at this piece as not being that kind of piece, right? I'm looking at this piece as being, more of a Renaissance, early Baroque style, and I forget whatever else I knew about Verdi. And I'm just sitting here talking, and I'm on camera, and we all make mistakes. So, silly me. All right. So that's what's going on here. It's 5 or 7, depending on how you look at it, to 1, and that 1 goes with that Picardy third. Now, I want to make one observation. Remember when I played this and I said, ooh, I shouldn't have done that? The traditional thing when you use the 7 chord is to not put the leading tone in the bass, because it gives you this dissonance here against the bass note. And that right there would have been a good clue, if even musically, that this piece was not as old as I was guessing. Because this, I'm not saying that Bach never would have done that, but it would have been a little more curious 200 years earlier than it was to have done that. Knowing that this piece is as recent as it is, that sound becomes more accepted. I mean, now when you get down to it, this piece is only 50 years before Rhapsody in Blue. So it's much closer to Rhapsody in Blue than it is to Bach as far as composition dates. So that's all good information. This is basically 5 to 1. And so why do that in inversion rather than put a G in the bass? I don't know. I don't know what else is going on in the piece voice leading wise, but here's an observation. The actual octave for that B is not very low. I mean, the piano is playing it down, or organ, or whatever accompaniment instrument is, it has it low, but the voices all have that pretty high. That B is right here. And so at some level, we could imagine a lower G also, right? So one reason why we don't typically want to write this in root position is because it gives us this dissonance against the bass, which was typically avoided. Dissonances are good, but dissonances against the bass were treated a little more special. And so at cadences, not so much 200 years earlier than this. But the other reason is, if some other part other than the bass wants to also have the leading tone, Now you're stuck with two leading tones both wanting to go to the tonic, which is parallel octaves, and we don't want that sound either. So very typically you do not put that leading tone in the bass in these cadences in a lot of types of settings, but it's perfectly fine if the no one else has to do it. If your melody is not the leading tone, and here our melody is, I mean, melody, it's counterpoint, they're all melodies, right? But the top voice is not the leading tone. No one else has the leading tone. And this idea that this voice here and that bass note are giving you parallel octaves, that doesn't count as parallel octaves. That's doubling the melody. They're both doing exactly the same thing, right? All the voices are being doubled in that part. So that doesn't count as parallels. That's just doubling. Doubling, good. So anyhow, that's my analysis here of what's going on. And as far as why else to use diminished chord here to put that, and he does the same thing here of playing with that relationship between the actual diminished sound and the dominant seventh sound. They're very closely related. He's not ever giving us both at the same time, but he's putting them in juxtaposition in a way where, yeah, it's basically, it's that sound. So I would have to understand a little more about the context to put any more insight into that, but I think I'm glad Graham brought this up and showed this. It ties really well into what I just talked about a minute ago, and love it. So I'm encouraging people to, just post your own little, random little insights like that, like I did with the Gershwin, because they're fun. They're fun to talk about, and I want people sharing and so forth. So we're now going to flip over to Graham's Over the Rainbow arrangement. So I'm just going to let this thing play through and see what we hear about it. Turn up my volume a little bit more. If I go back 4 bars, makes more sense. That's good to know. So that'll be something to comment. I'd love you to put in your comments on Graham's observation, or put them in here. All right, so I'm just going to let this thing play, and we'll talk about it. So this is an arrangement that Graham did of Over the Rainbow. I'm going to pause it right there because I don't think he intends us to be hearing those chord symbols playing back. So I'm going to actually turn that off. I'm just going to come over here and mute the chord symbol channels because I think they were just in there for analysis purpose. That is my guess, because they're not providing particularly effective accompaniment. And that was the verse to the piece. If you're not familiar with how musical theater and movie songs, that kind of songbook, American songbook era pieces were put together, typically there was that introductory part, which is transition between the dialogue of the show or the movie and the actual sung part. So typically it's like a little bit out of tempo, and then the chorus is the part we all know. So if you're listening to that going, that's not Over the Rainbow, yeah, it is. It's the verse. It's the part that gets done in the movie before the song itself. Here comes the song itself, the chorus. Yeah, that is really lovely, Graham. You've done a lot of really nice things in here. There's so much we could unpack, and I've spent a lot of time talking about a lot of other things. But mostly, I just want to point out some of the highlights of this for me. First of all, my favorite aspect about it is the different textures, right? The way there's chorale style passages, there's places with the oohs over the melody or under the melody. There's different ways of working with the four voices, and that is so important to an interesting arrangement. I mean, yes, a piece that's nothing but chorale can be interesting, or nothing but melody over whole notes can be interesting. Like this section here is melody against whole notes. And that's a lovely sound. If that whole section had been all the chorale style thing, then it would weaken the piece because now it's got one less texture. Textural variety is a big part of what's going to make things interesting in this kind of arrangement. And so he's got that kind of going on, through the beginning, the oohs with the melodies above, and it starts with the melody above the oohs, but then it switches to melody below the oohs. Great stuff, right? Now he's going into more of the chorale style stuff when the chorus starts. But he's got all sorts of interesting voice leading stuff happening. I'm just going to focus on a couple of things here. So one thing, I got to remember to let both voices play. I'm going to pause right there. The bass hasn't gotten below that E flat yet. He's holding back on the bass. Now, he's let the bass sing lower before. He let the bass sing lower just in the previous measure, right? Of all the range things to think about, thinking about the bass range probably has the most profound, no, soprano and bass range. Because if you let the sopranos go super, super high, obviously that gives a certain intensity to the music, and you do it only when you want that super highness. But thinking about the bass in a similar way, but not to the same extreme. When the bass goes low, there's a certain fullness to the sound that we mostly expect most of the time. When that doesn't happen, when the bass is up higher, there's a certain lightness to the sound. There's another aspect of textural variety. So we're going to have that light sound, but we'll also have a deeper sound when the bass gets lower, like it's about to. Now the bass is down lower. I'm surprised that he didn't choose to resolve that lullaby to a root position chord. He chose to keep the bass on the B flat. And I'm assuming he did that because he still wants to hold back, that he still doesn't want to go all the way into full-on bass, because low E flat would be a very deep low note, and he didn't want to go there yet, right? And if he just went up to here, then it's higher. It's the root, but it's higher than that B flat. So I'm sure this was a deliberate decision to keep that resolution in that second inversion. I love this contrary motion here, right? Right, it's a cool. I mean, in some ways a silly little line, right? It's a scale going down, but it sounds so cool the way it resolves against the melody. So that was like a really nice little insight he had to bring that in. I like the way he brings in this key change here, and he does the key change by basically having the melody ascend. So normally it would have gone, where you'll find me, or something like that, right? And then, but he's going up. Now, it's a little curious that he went up to the F sharp, which sort of suggests that you're going to go something like this. Where you'll find me, some somewhere, right? You kind of want to hear that F sharp go up to the G sharp, but my gosh, that G sharp is a pretty high note, and that would have been some screaming from the sopranos. So he's like, nah, we're not going to do that. I'm going to set up this tension of letting that climb up there, but then let's release that tension, not resolving that. So that's one of those conscious decisions you make. Because often you would say, I want to resolve that, but it would have really put a texture on this piece that probably isn't the texture that he wanted. So I approve of that decision, even if I might have chosen to do things differently. I like that he then uses that descending line again here. So clever. So that's he already did that with a descending line, but when he did it before, it was descending in eighth notes. That's not even the one. He's used that trick a bunch of times, I guess. Where's the other one? Well, you saw it. Yeah, right here. So it's descending in eighth notes, but now he has it descending in quarter notes, and yet it still works. And now we get the low notes, right? That was nice time-honored melodic line to end the piece with. Here, I would definitely suggest that if your bass could get down to the low E, which they probably can, that could be a nice deep way of finishing it. But if you don't want it to finish deep, then by all means keep the bass not that low. But given that the bass just had the F sharp down here, I feel a little like here I would have appreciated the low E. That's like the one place where I'm most thinking I would have possibly wanted to be able to do that low E. Half the bassists singing this are going to do it on their own because they feel like it. All right. So anyhow, I'm going to wrap up. Talked about a ton of stuff today, right? And so I hope people got something out of some of it. And next week, I'll probably talk a little bit more about Rhapsody in Blue, see what other music comes up. But then we're getting close to talking about the to getting into the counterpoint course. I've still got stuff to settle through at my end, both in terms of the website and in terms of other things that before I'm ready to say, yes, we're ready to launch the counterpoint course. But I am expecting, by the end of the month, we'll be launching the counterpoint course and talking about counterpoint a lot in here. So thanks, Dean, also for the comment about the engraving and the slurs and the melisma. And Graham, if you are watching or check this out later, yeah, that is definitely good advice. So I will see you all next time. Thanks for being here.